The wind, a howling banshee born of ice and malice, clawed at Caleb's face, each gust laden with frozen needles that sought the warmth of his blood. It was a white devil, this blizzard, come to claim the high peaks of the Grizzly Tooth Range, and Caleb, a man carved from the same stubborn granite as the mountains themselves, was caught in its maw. His axe, usually an extension of his will against the ancient pines, now served as a desperate anchor against the storm's fury as he fought his way back towards the faint promise of his solitary cabin. Then, through the screaming chaos, a sound not of nature's making, a splintering crack, followed by a muffled, almost human cry, swallowed near instantly by the tempest. Caleb froze, his weathered face, a mask of grim endurance, turning towards the unnatural disturbance. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before dusk, narrowed, scanning the swirling white. He saw it then, a darker shape against the snow, a grotesque parody of shelter, an overturned carriage, one wheel still spinning lazily, like a dying prayer. He moved, not with haste, for haste was death in such conditions, but with a grim, ponderous purpose, the snowdrift sucking at his worn leather boots. The wind shrieked a warning, as if daring him to interfere with its grim harvest. As he drew closer, the scene resolved itself into a tableau of brutal tragedy. The fine wood of the carriage was shattered, its rich velvet upholstery, now exposed, already stiffening with frost. Horses, noble beasts, lay broken and still, their breath crystallizing in the air no more. But it was the faint whimper from beside the wreckage that drew Caleb's gaze, a sound so fragile it seemed impossible it could exist in this frozen hell. There, sheltered partially by a drift and a tattered remnant of the carriage's expensive fabric, lay a woman. Snow had begun to shroud her like a premature burial gown. Her face, pale as alabaster, was framed by dark hair matted with ice. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow, almost imperceptible. And cradled against her breast, wrapped in layers of what looked like silk and wool, was a bundle. Another whimper, impossibly small, emanated from it. A newborn. Caleb knelt, the cold seeping through his thick trousers, forgotten. He brushed the snow from the woman's face. Her skin was like ice. He touched her neck, searching for a pulse. Faint. Thready. A flicker of life in a dying ember. The baby, he saw, was tiny, its face a pinched, blue-white miniature of human suffering. A silent question hung in the roaring wind, leave them to the fate the mountains had decreed, or fight a battle he had not sought, a battle he was ill-equipped to win? His cabin was small, his supplies meager, meant for one. To take them in was to invite hardship, perhaps starvation, certainly to shatter the bitter peace of his isolation. His eyes lingered on the infant's face. A memory, sharp and jagged as a shard of ice, pierced through him, another small face, another storm, another loss he had been powerless to prevent. The old wound, always present, throbbed with a fresh, unbearable agony. If you were Caleb, faced with the ghosts of your past and the frozen reality of the present, what would you do? Tell me, what choice does a man have when life itself, in its most vulnerable form, whispers for aid in the heart of death? He made his decision. With a grunt, born more of grim resolve than physical effort, he gently disentangled the infant from the woman's failing grasp. The baby let out a thin, protesting cry, a sound that cut through Caleb like a rusty blade. He unbuttoned his thick mackinaw coat, the wind immediately biting at his exposed chest, and tucked the bundled child inside, against the rough wool of his shirt and the meager warmth of his own body. Then, with a tenderness that belied his calloused hands and rugged exterior, he lifted the woman. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile burden. The journey back to his cabin, a mere half-mile, became an odyssey, each step a monumental effort against the storm's relentless assault and the dead weight of his own resurrected grief. The wind tore at them, trying to rip them apart, to reclaim its prizes. But Caleb, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on an invisible point in the swirling white, plodded on, a solitary figure of defiance against the indifferent cruelty of the wilderness, two fragile lives now bound to his own. The scent of pine from his cabin's chimney, usually a comfort, was now a beacon of desperate hope. The cabin door, hewn from thick pine, groaned in protest as Caleb shouldered it open, the wind trying to follow him inside like a hungry wolf. He kicked it shut, the latch falling with a solid thud that seemed to momentarily silence the storm's rage, or perhaps merely contain it outside the fragile sanctuary he had built with his own hands. The single room was small, sparse, yet held the concentrated warmth of the stone fireplace where embers still glowed. He laid the woman gently on his own narrow cot, the only bed in the place, its rough blankets a stark contrast to the fine, albeit torn, fabric of her dress. Her breathing was a shallow whisper in the sudden quiet. He then turned his attention to the infant, unwrapping it carefully. A boy, he noted, small and frail, his skin still tinged with a dangerous blue. The child's eyes were squeezed shut, its tiny fists clenched. Caleb, a man more accustomed to the heft of an axe than the delicacy of a newborn, found his large, work-roughened hands surprisingly gentle as he chafed the baby's limbs, trying to coax warmth back into them. He stoked the fire, adding precious dry wood until it roared, casting flickering shadows that danced on the rough-hewn log walls. He found an old, clean linen scrap, dipped it in warmed water from the kettle he kept perpetually near the hearth, and began to carefully clean the infant's face. As he worked, fragments of his past swirled in his mind like the snow outside. He saw another cabin, smaller, cruder, buried in a drift. He saw his Sarah, her face pale, her hand cold in his. And their own babe, a little girl, born too soon, taken by a fever the winter before the blizzard claimed her mother. He had failed them. He had been strong, a good woodsman, but he could not conquer sickness, nor the ferocity of nature when it turned its teeth upon his own. That failure had driven him here, to this isolation, a self-imposed penance. Now, this woman, this child. It felt like a cruel jest of fate, or perhaps, a desperate, final chance for a redemption he hadn't dared to seek. The woman on the cot stirred, a low moan escaping her chapped lips. Her eyes, a startling deep violet, flickered open, unfocused, clouded with pain and confusion. She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. "Easy now," Caleb's voice was gruff, unused to softness. "You're safe." The babe too, her gaze drifted towards the sound of the infant, a faint cry as Caleb wrapped it in a piece of his own worn but clean flannel shirt. A flicker of understanding, then terror, then a dawning, fragile hope crossed her face before her eyelids fluttered closed again. He knew little of doctoring, beyond what the wilderness taught of survival. He cleaned her visible wounds, mostly cuts and bruises from the crash, thankful there seemed to be no broken bones he could discern. He brewed a weak broth from dried meat and herbs, forcing a few spoonfuls between her lips when she briefly roused. Days blurred into a rhythm of tending the fire, caring for the infant, and watching over the unconscious woman. He named the boy Leo in his mind, for the fierce, tiny roar he sometimes emitted when hungry or cold. The name felt right, a small beacon of courage. He slept little, propped in his one wooden chair by the fire, his old rifle leaning against the wall, a silent sentinel. He noticed the quality of her torn dress, the fineness of the lace at her cuffs, the subtle scent of a forgotten perfume clinging to her despite her ordeal. There was a small, velvet pouch tied to her wrist, which he hadn't dared to open. She was no simple traveler. Who was she? And what ill fortune had brought her to his desolate doorstep? The storm eventually broke, revealing a world transformed, draped in a pristine, blinding white. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Leo's occasional cries. Ilara, as he heard her murmur in a moment of semi-lucidity, began to stabilize. Her fever, which had raged for a day, subsided. Her eyes, when they opened, held more awareness, studying him with a mixture of apprehension and a dawning, exhausted gratitude. She saw the lines etched deep around his eyes, the grey in his beard, the hardness of a man long acquainted with solitude and sorrow. But she also saw the way his large hand soothed her son, the unwavering vigil he kept. One morning, the early sun, pale but promising, streamed through the cabin's single small window, painting a stripe of light across the dirt floor. Ilara was awake, truly awake, her violet eyes clear, though shadowed with a deep weariness. She watched Caleb as he expertly changed a makeshift diaper on Leo, his movements surprisingly deft. He had fashioned a tiny cradle from a hollowed log, lined with rabbit fur, and now rocked it gently with his foot. "Thank you," her voice was still weak, but steady. It was cultured, with a faint, unplaceable accent that spoke of distant lands and refined upbringing. Caleb merely grunted, a sound that could mean anything, but his gaze softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at the child. He's strong, she whispered, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. Like his protector, Caleb felt a flush creep up his neck, unaccustomed to such words. He busied himself at the hearth, stirring a thin porridge. You need to eat. Get your strength back. Over the next few days, as she slowly regained some measure of health, the story began to unfold, piece by piece, like a shattered mosaic being reassembled. She was Baroness Ilara von Strauss, she told him, her voice gaining strength with each passing day. Her family held estates, vast and wealthy, in a land across the great ocean, a place of old castles and older titles. She had come to this raw, new country with her husband, Baron Friedrich, a man with a vision for enterprise, for building something new. But Friedrich, she explained, her eyes clouding with a fresh wave of pain, had died suddenly a few months prior, a fever, swift and merciless. Her voice broke as she recounted how, left vulnerable and pregnant, she found herself at the mercy of her late husband's business partner, a man named Silas Thorne. Thorne, initially a sycophant, revealed himself as a viper. He had coveted Friedrich's share of their ventures, and with Friedrich gone, he saw Ilara and her unborn child as mere obstacles. He had tried to pressure her into signing over her inheritance, then into marriage. When she refused, his demeanor turned openly hostile. He said I was overwrought with grief, that I wasn't fit to manage my affairs, or to be a mother. Her hand went to the small velvet pouch at her wrist. With trembling fingers, she opened it and drew out a heavy gold locket, intricately carved with a family crest. Inside, a miniature portrait of a stern-looking man with kind eyes, her father, she explained. Thorne arranged the journey to a supposed sanatorium in the mountains, she continued, her voice laced with bitterness. For mine health, I knew it was a lie. He meant for me never to reach it, or never to leave it. The driver, he was one of Thorne's men. He drove recklessly. I think he meant to cause an accident in a remote place. Caleb listened, his expression unreadable, his silence a heavy weight in the small cabin. He had seen the darkness in men before, their greed, their cruelty. This Thorne sounded like a man cast from that same vile mold. He thought of the fine carriage, the expensive clothes, the sheer desperation that must have driven her. His isolated world had been breached by a drama far larger and more dangerous than any blizzard. The news of a wrecked fancy carriage and a missing noblewoman would eventually filter down from the mountains, even to the small, scattered settlements. Men like Thorne would not give up easily, not with so much at stake. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in his gut, that they would come looking. What then? Hand her over to this vulture? The thought was anathema. The memory of Sarah, of his own lost child, solidified his resolve. He had failed once. He would not fail again. He looked at Ilara, at the fierce, protective love in her eyes as she gazed at Leo, now sleeping peacefully in his makeshift cradle. He saw not a baroness, but a mother, a woman fighting for her child's life against a tide of malice. The moral imperative was clear, stark as the snow-covered peaks outside. He would protect them. He rose and went to the corner where his heavy logging axe leaned. He picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, testing its razor edge with his thumb. Then he checked his rifle, the old Winchester, cleaning the barrel, counting the few cartridges he possessed. His eyes, when they met Ilara's, held a new light, not of anger, but of a quiet, unshakable determination. They'll come, he said, his voice low and steady. But this cabin, it seemed worse than them. Ilara saw the shift in him, the silent warrior emerging from the stoic woodsman. A fragile seedling of hope, planted in the frozen wasteland of her despair, began to grow, nurtured by this stranger's unexpected, formidable courage. The uneasy peace of the following days was a taut string, vibrating with unspoken anticipation. Caleb moved with a quiet intensity, reinforcing the cabin's single door with a thick wooden bar, checking the shutters on the two small windows, ensuring they could be secured from within. He taught Ilara how to load the ancient rifle, her delicate hand surprisingly steady as she handled the cold steel, her violet eyes narrowed in concentration. She was a quick study, driven by a primal need to protect her son. He ventured out only when necessary, his senses hyper-alert, scanning the vast white expanse for any sign of movement, his ears straining for the telltale sound of approaching horses. The wilderness, once his solace, now felt like a hunting ground where they were the prey. He spoke little of his preparations, but his actions were eloquent. He carved notches into the logs near the windows, creating firing slits. He stockpiled firewood inside, enough to last a siege. Ilara watched him, her heart a mixture of fear and a burgeoning, fierce admiration. This quiet, haunted man was her only shield against the storm of Silas Thorne's greed. One afternoon, as the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, Caleb, perched in a tall pine overlooking the approach to his valley, saw them. 3 riders, dark figures against the snow, moving with a grim purpose. He didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. He slid down the tree, his movement swift and silent as a forest cat, and raced back to the cabin. "They're here," he announced, his voice devoid of emotion, yet it sent a chill down Ilara's spine. "Bar the door. Keep Leo quiet, if you can." Stay away from the windows. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at Ilara, but she pushed it down, her gaze fixed on Caleb's resolute face. She nodded, her hand instinctively going to the locket at her throat, then to her son, sleeping soundly in his cradle. The riders approached slowly, cautiously, their eyes scanning the small cabin, the plume of smoke rising from its chimney. One man, taller than the others, with a cruel slash of a mouth and eyes like chips of obsidian, dismounted. Silas Thorne. Even from a distance, Caleb could feel the arrogance radiating from him. Thorne swaggered towards the cabin, his men flanking him, their hands resting on their holstered guns. "Ho, the cabin!" Thorne's voice was unctuous, yet carried an underlying menace. "We're looking for a lady, a baroness. Traveling with a newborn. Seen anyone of that description, woodsman?" Silence from within. Caleb stood just inside the door, rifle in hand, his eye to a narrow crack between the logs. He could see Thorne sneer. "Come now," Thorne called out, his voice hardening. "There's a reward. A substantial reward for her safe return. She's unwell. Confused. Needs our help." Caleb's lip curled. The hypocrisy was galling. "She's not here." Caleb's voice, when it came, was flat, hard as river stone. Thorne chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Don't be a fool, old man. We know she's in there. We tracked her carriage. Send her out, and no harm will come to you. Protect her, and you'll share her fate. She's under my protection," Caleb stated, his words a clear line drawn in the snow. Thorne's face darkened. Brave words for a man alone. "There are 3 of us. We can burn you out. Or wait until you starve." He paused, then his voice turned silky, dangerous. "Or perhaps the child, such a fragile thing. A shame if it were to suffer because of your stubbornness." Ilara, hearing this, gasped, clutching Leo tighter. Caleb's knuckles whitened on the rifle stock. The threat against the child was the spark to the tinder. His eyes, usually calm, now held a cold fire. "You'll not touch them," he said, his voice a low growl. "Try, and you'll learn what a grisly tooth welcome feels like." Thorne laughed again, but it lacked conviction. He gestured to his men. "Burn it." One of the thugs dismounted, pulling a torch and flint from his saddlebag. As he bent to strike the flint, a shot rang out. Not from Caleb's rifle. The thug cried out, dropping the torch, clutching his shoulder as dark blood blossomed on his coat. All eyes turned towards a ridge overlooking the cabin. A lone figure sat astride a horse, a smoking rifle in his hand. Sheriff Brody. His face was grim. "That's enough, Thorne," Brody's voice boomed across the snow-filled clearing. "I got word you were up here, harassing folks. This ain't your territory to be making threats and burning cabins." Thorne spun around, his face a mask of fury. "Brody! This is none of your concern. This is a private matter. Attempted arson and threatening murder ain't private matters in my county." "Thorne," Brody retorted, his rifle still leveled. and I heard tell this lady you're looking for ain't exactly unwell or confused or more like fleeing for her life from a damn scoundrel's." Thorne's other man, seeing the sheriff and sensing the tide turning, began to look uneasy, his hand inching away from his gun. Thorne, however, was consumed by rage and desperation. He drew his own pistol, quick as a snake, and pointed it towards the cabin door. "She's mine. Her fortune, her child, mine." But Caleb was ready. As Thorne's gun came up, Caleb fired. His shot was true, hitting Thorne's gun hand. The pistol clattered into the snow. Thorne screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and thwarted greed. Sheriff Brody and his deputy, who had appeared silently from the trees, quickly disarmed and subdued Thorne's remaining man, while Brody himself advanced on the wounded, whimpering antagonist. The siege was over, almost before it truly began. The quiet courage of one man, and the timely arrival of the law, had tipped the scales of justice. Caleb slowly unbarred the door, the rifle still held ready, his eyes scanning for any further threat. He saw Elara, pale but resolute, Leo held protectively in her arms. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze was a universe of relief, gratitude, and a bond forged in fear and fire. The aftermath was a quiet flurry of activity under the cold, indifferent gaze of the mountains. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weathered face spoke of a hard-won wisdom and an unshakable sense of duty, efficiently trussed up a cursing Silas Thorne and his now thoroughly cowed henchman. "Heard some ugly rumors about you down in Pinetown, Thorne," Brody said, his voice like grinding stones as he tightened a rope. "Seems they were true. Trying to steal a woman's inheritance, threatening her child. That's low, even for scum like you." Thorne, clutching his bleeding hand, could only glare venomously, his arrogance shattered, replaced by a sullen, impotent rage. Elara, wrapped in one of Caleb's spare blankets, stood by the cabin doorway, Leo now sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. She watched as the sheriff prepared to lead the captives away. Her gaze then turned to Caleb. He was leaning against the cabin wall, his face etched with exhaustion, a dark stain of his own blood seeping through his sleeve where a stray splinter from Thorne's wild shot had grazed him. But his eyes, when they met hers, were clear, the haunted shadows within them noticeably diminished. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but they no longer held him captive. He had faced a new storm, a human one, and this time, he had not failed. He had protected the innocent. He had stood firm. Elara approached him, her steps hesitant at first, then more certain. "Caleb," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "There are no words to express what you've done for us. You saved our lives. You saved Leo's future." She reached out, her hand, small and fine-boned, resting gently on his rough, calloused one. "You are the bravest, most honorable man I have ever known." Caleb looked down at their joined hands, a strange warmth spreading through him, a feeling he had thought long dead. He felt awkward, unused to such praise, yet a quiet sense of rightness settled in his soul. "Just did what needed doing," he mumbled, though his eyes conveyed a deeper understanding. Sheriff Brody, before mounting his horse, approached them. He said to Elara, tipping his hat. "Baroness, you and the little one will be safe now. Thorne will face justice. My deputy will escort you to Pinetown. There's a good doctor there, and the telegraph. You can contact your people." Elara nodded, her gratitude encompassing him as well. "Thank you, Sheriff, for everything." As the small procession, the lawmen, their prisoners, and Elara with Leo, now bundled securely and riding one of Thorne's confiscated horses led by the deputy, prepared to depart, Elara turned to Caleb one last time. "You must let me repay you, Caleb," she insisted. "Come with us. There is a place for you. You will want for nothing. My family, they will wish to thank you, to honor you." Caleb looked out at the snow-covered peaks, at the familiar, silent sentinels of his solitude. He then looked at his small, sturdy cabin, a place of sorrow, but now also a place of unexpected redemption. He thought of the life she offered, comfort, security, a world away from the harshness he knew. It was a tempting vision. But he was a man of the mountains, his roots sunk deep into this wild, unforgiving land. It had shaped him, broken him, and now, in its own way, healed him. "Thank you, Baroness," he said, his voice gentle. "But this is my place," he gestured to the vast wilderness. "I'll take a bit for the supplies I used, and maybe for a new pane of glass for that window Thorn's man near shattered. But I reckon the piece I found right here is payment enough." Ilara's eyes filled with tears, but she understood. She saw the quiet strength, the profound integrity that could not be bought or bartered. She took the velvet pouch from her wrist and pressed it into his hand. At least this, for Leo's sake. For his first protector. Inside, he would later find, were gold coins, more than enough to repair his cabin 100 times over, and the intricate gold locket. He would keep the locket, a memento of the storm that had brought life, in its most fragile and precious form, back into his frozen world. They parted then, Ilara looking back until the cabin was a mere speck against the snow, Caleb watching until they disappeared over the ridge. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the mountains enveloping him once more, but it was a different silence now, no longer empty, but filled with the echo of a child's cry, the warmth of a woman's gratitude, and the quiet satisfaction of a battle well fought. Months later, the snows had retreated, and the high country bloomed with the fierce, brief beauty of alpine summer. Caleb was still there, his axe still ringing against the pines, but there was a new lightness in his step, a new calm in his eyes. Occasionally, a rider would bring him a letter, penned in an elegant hand, telling of a thriving little boy named Leo, and of a baroness who spoke often to her son of a brave lumberjack in the distant mountains. On his rough-hewn mantelpiece, beside a carefully preserved gold locket, sat a small, exquisitely carved wooden bear, a toy he'd whittled during the long spring evenings. He was alone, but no longer entirely solitary. The wilderness was still his home, but now, it was a home where hope had taken root. What do you think became of Caleb? Did he ever venture down from his mountain again? And what of Baroness Ilara and young Leo? Would their paths ever cross with their grizzled savior once more? Perhaps some stories are best left with the wind and the whispering pines. If this tale of courage and redemption moved you, consider the strength found in unexpected places, and the quiet heroes who walk among us. Don't forget to explore more stories of inspiration and moral fortitude right here. Click on that next video, and subscribe for more tales that stir the soul.